France, hence the accent. Um, so movies, American movies, which was my obsession, would literally come about 6 months after the American release. But what was available were the soundtrack albums. So I have to say I fell in love with American cinemas through music, and it was mainly John Williams's music. Jerry Goldsmith as well, but I would say it was mainly John. And the first ones that really had an impact on me were the disaster movies, Towering Inferno, Earthquake, Poseidon Adventure, and then of course Jaws, and then of course Star Wars and everything. But those first impressions were really the grand spectacles that those movies were, and he scores to them.
What was it about his music that stood out for you? I mean, I'm curious, just individually, what makes his music special to you?
You know, what stood out for me was really his music is a character in the film, and the music was really characters in those movies, and they. The 70s was such an incredible time for movies, but the technology wasn't there for that we have today. So when you went to see Superman, I mean, Superman could fly, but it wasn't the perfection that you see today. And so therefore the music had a role to really make you fly with him, And it was true also for Jaws. The shark was in there a lot. When you think about the shark in Jaws, is barely there because it didn't work for the most part, but Steven kept it like very hidden. And the music was there to fill in the gaps. And so the music was really a character, and that's really what stood out for me. Also, there was no home entertainment, especially living in France. Those great movies that I loved were not shown on TV. So the only way to really relive that experience was through the music. And as I said, that was my discovery, that became my journey. To the point where, I had a joke with John because I said, sometimes I would fantasize about the film just listening to his music. And there were a couple of occasions where I saw the movie and I'm like, oh my God, the movie sucks. Your music is so great. And like, what would be that movie? I said, well, Monsignor is Christopher Reeve. And I'm like, the movie was so bad. And when I heard the soundtrack for 6 months prior to seeing the film, I was like, this is going to be the best movie I've ever seen. So his impact really on me was tremendous. And I really learned the power of music. And then it sort of helped me understand film history, particularly Bernard Herrmann, because I became a huge fan of Hitchcock growing up, of course, and to see, how Herrmann also made music that became characters in Hitchcock's movies was, I wasn't surprised when John told me of his friendship with Herrmann, and their sort of, that he was the one composer he looked up to in the film world.
I'm curious your take on this as a historian, a film historian, because we take it for granted now that, like, oh yeah, John Williams was just on this rocket to the stars and everything was perfect, and of course Star Wars worked and everything, but like him coming on the scene with Steven Spielberg and Star Wars and these kind of old-fashioned classical scores was such an anomaly. It was an anachronism, because we had like Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy and all these like kind of pop song soundtracks, and we were kind of doing away with that. So why do you think that kind of old-fashioned style of scoring caught on with the public the way that it did back in the 70s?
Well, it did because the filmmakers that were working with him were also classically trained. In other words, Stephen, George, De Palma, who worked with John, were real lovers of old Hollywood movies. John Ford and William Wyler, all the greats. And John is the same way. He loves classical, music and the history of music and has great reverence for it. So suddenly those young filmmakers who were making incredible movies that, they were taking it out on the ocean and all that, like not filming Jaws in a backlot tank. They were, in a sense, braving the studio system, but they were still having this sort of classical approach to cinema. And I think that sort of recognition between John and Stephen, and John and George, and John and Brian, sort of became an obvious thing, And it's interesting, the next generation of filmmakers are working with Vangelis or Giorgio Moroder. They're much more influenced by music videos and fast cutting, and don't have the same reverence that the generation of Stephen, had for music. And so I think that explains why, and therefore, the public loved the cinema of Stephen and George so much that they were accepting of the music, and vice versa, I also think that in order to enter a world like Star Wars, which was a movie that was plagued with the studio thinking this was going to be a huge flop, had it been a modern type of science fiction kind of score, the audience would have been a lot less likely to identify with that world and want to embrace, Chewbacca and company, So the music was really an essential ingredient to hooking us into a world that felt familiar. And in fact, I always quote the famous 2001, the Kubrick movie. For those who don't know, Alex North, who was originally hired to do a score for the film, and Kubrick threw it out and kept the temp music in the film, which was classical music. And I think Alex North's score would have dated the movie today, because he was trying to be modern, he was trying to be, and it's an amazing score, as you know, but it just would not have worked with the film. It would have made the movie, it would have dated the movie. But the fact that we're watching this incredible odyssey in space with the Blue Danube makes it completely relatable, And I think that's something that John and George and the great, directors he worked with understood and were very complicit in that.
By making it feel old-fashioned, old-style, classical, it makes it timeless. Essentially, it doesn't date the movie.
Yeah, and I hate the word old. I would say classic.
Yeah. It's incredible to me. Like, most film composers have a shelf life. They have their kind of peak of popularity, and then they kind of fall off, and people move on to the next flavor. And yet, John Williams can still fill the Hollywood Bowl 3 nights a year, packed to the gills, and he does that around the world. So why do you think, and maybe it's the same answer as the last one, but why do you think people still connect to his music?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, it kind of feels that John Williams is passed on through generations, because it's fascinating, to your point, that John has fascinated and not only audiences, from Jaws and Star Wars, and then the generation of Jurassic Park, and then the generation of Harry Potter, and now the new generation of the new Star Wars films, So those filmmakers have followed him, the new filmmakers have followed him, but the audience has had the same rapport with him. And so, the word timeless really is appropriate for him, but I think he's also out of sort of like what you can call timeless, because he is boundless in a sense, So yeah, I really find that admirable, that not only filmmakers who could go with and many do that, like Christopher Nolan, for example, but a lot of filmmakers still like that sort of orchestral, symphonic, thematic driven music, and and I think that's kind of a worldwide kind of thing also. So it's not only timeless, but it's universal. I can say, when I go back to France and I was just there promoting this film, I mean, it was crazy, as much as here they recognize John's incredible ability to create music that not only plays with those films, but as the concert, prove it, can be played outside the world of images. I can tell you, that when I first moved to New York, which was the summer of E.T., now dating myself, of course, this is before cell phones and being able to call your parents or anything. I had a Walkman, and I bought the cassette of E.T. and played that as I was braving New York, and that sort of helped me not be afraid in a sense. So his music has really accompanied me in my journey through, my love for cinema, which made me move to America. But he's very much responsible for it, which is why this was important. Of course, I think in a macro way, to do finally a film on him, but in a micro way, selfishly about me saying thank you.
I can relate. I'm so curious about just the process of making this film. So your basic entry is you start to work for Steven Spielberg, with Steven Spielberg in the 90s, right? In what capacity did you enter Steven's orbit?
So it was kind of interesting. There was a bit of a revolution in the home entertainment world where Laserdiscs were appearing, and Universal Studios was very much looking to release special editions where you would have the film, at times, additional scenes and archival footage and documentaries to go with them. And one of the very first ones was 1941, Steven's sort of cult film that was a total flop when it came out. And he had added scenes to it, and the head of post-production at Amblin, sadly no longer with us, Marty Cohen, had heard about me and heard that I loved 1941. And that was true. So I met with him, and he said, well, Steven wants to do a documentary. Do you want to do it? I'm like, yeah. But I had never done a documentary before. I had been in feature development working for Bette Midler, actually, at Disney. So I was far from sort of doing documentaries. But it was an opportunity, and it was a dream to meet Steven in some capacity, and John. And so I jumped right in without really thinking that this was going to be a career, really. But the thing that was interesting is that I was hitting a bit of a wall in Hollywood. I'd been here 2 or 3 years, and it just wasn't really happening for me. And I was thinking, listen, I'm still young. I can go back to France and start over because, now I speak English fluently. Maybe I have some experience I can bring to France. And so really that experience on 1941 gave me not only the hope that there was something else, but literally, because I hit it off with Steven and his team, a career. And I was there at the right time, at the right moment, where there was this revolution in home entertainment, because from Laserdiscs, then we went to DVDs and Blu-rays, and now streaming, I was extremely lucky, but I worked very hard. I was so dedicated and so inspired by the people I was working with, and finally having a chance to work on classic films I really, truly loved. But I was as intimidated to meet Steven as I was to meet John. Because, as you know, talking about music is not easy. It's easier in a sense to talk about images and say, that scene in blah, 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 it's amazing. But to talk about music and not feel like you're just saying how great the music is very hard. And I certainly didn't want this movie to be a hit parade of the greatest tunes, even though it has that element to it. And I didn't want it to be also, how great it is. It had to have always a story behind it. So that was the challenge.
And it is a challenge because he has achieved this godlike status in our culture. When I interviewed Ryan Johnson, who did one of the recent Star Wars movies, he said, you can't talk about John Williams without sounding like you're dedicating national parkland or something. It's hard. Everyone just wants to say how amazing he is because he is. So how did you come up with like a thesis or how did you find the story of this film to avoid that trap?
I mean, I have to say that this is a case I've been very fortunate to make many films, but this was a case like where it sort of, I've waited so long to make it, in a sense, that it sort of came naturally. I hate to say it organically, but it sort of did. However, I had many. First of all, John was super resistant, and it was thanks to Steven that he eventually said yes. And also the fact that I said to him at some point, I said, John, this is not about you. He looked at me like, okay. And I said, it's about your music, and it's about your musicians. And I understood at that moment, when his face sort of lit up, that I was never going to ask him a personal question. In fact, I never did. When he talks about the loss of his wife, which I knew this was going to be brought up at some point, but I didn't want to ask him the question. I said, tell me about the first violin concerto. And he said, well, when my wife, blah, blah, blah. And that's the answer you have in the film. But I never asked him a personal question. I only approached him through music. And it was very touching because I just felt that I was channeling kind of, we almost had an understanding and a pact, and I think he understood what I needed, and I also understood that I was speaking his language, even though I'm not a musician, and I was probably clumsy in some of my interpretations or in my approaches, but it worked. To the point where I would again bump into him and I'd say, when are we doing our next little session? And he got excited about it. And it was interesting also, I would ask him, okay, so next time I'd like to do this. And he's like, no. So I'll give you an example. I said, I heard that you did different versions of the famous notes from Close Encounters, and that you still have them. So I'd like you to be at the piano, and I'll film you, and you'll play the different incarnations of it. And he said, no, I'm not doing this. And but he said it was a smile and elegance, and he said, here's the thing. People who love Close Encounters know those 5 notes, and it would be betraying the film to sort of play anything else, even if only one person in the audience says, oh, that would have been better, with 6 notes, or that version would have been better. But I'll give you something that is equally as interesting. And he did, and that's what you have in the film, which is his explanation of music and how music is basically a language. And it was so great because, of course, he topped it off with saying I asked him too many questions. I don't see myself as an interviewer. I see those, I hate when sometimes, I read reviews and they say talking heads. I'm like, talking heads? It's called a close-up. It's not called a talking head. Those are close-ups into the soul of those great creators and geniuses like John and Steven and people I've had the privilege of talking to. What would we give to have that kind of document of Mozart or Beethoven or, any number of great artists? And so it's a real big it's a real big responsibility, and I get mad at my editors when they cut away. I'm like, no, we can. And I had an example of that, for example, with Kate Capshaw talking about Schindler's, and she said, "Oh, look at my tears," and the editor cut. I said, no, I know there's another beat where she tried to say something and she couldn't. And we had 2 cameras on her, and I said, I just want the A cam, and I don't want to cut until I tell you to cut, And so I'm just going on, but it is such a craft, and I've learned so much making this film, because I every film is a new thing, and convincing John to do this and to ultimately have him watch the film and like it and call me was so meaningful. And I showed it to Stephen first, and he came out of I think I told you that story, but he came out of the screening room and he was crying, and he had a box full of Kleenex. And he said, take a picture of me. So I took a picture of him with the Kleenex, and he gave me a hug, and I said, I was crying, and I said, Steve and I worked so hard. And he said, I don't see the work, all I see is the love. So.
That's a pretty nice compliment. Trying to cram 92 years of a man's life, as prolific as he is, 65-year career or whatever, into like an hour and a half basically, seems like the most impossible task. So I'm curious what kind of things you got for the doc that you had to cut that was the most painful, or pieces of the story that you wanted to include but just didn't have the space to include it.
No, I mean, listen, there was no restrictions in the running time. It's my own process that I don't want my films to be too long. I have sat through screenings of many movies, and you feel the energy from the audience when it's too long, and it's an exercise for me to try and stay as compact as possible. I never ever hope to be definitive, ever, or else I'd be would still be watching next week, and I just feel that it's something that I impose on myself to say, this has to be an hour and 45 minutes, max. And I made another film this year, it was Faye Dunaway, and it was the same thing. I was just like 95, 100 minutes max, and I don't know, that forces you to find the essence of things as opposed to the Wikipedia approach of, you have to have everything in the kitchen sink in there. It's like perfume, it's like an essence that you put on and you smell it and you just live with it. But it's not the counter at the store, all kinds of essence, so it's hard, as you said, he's lived a long life and he's been making music or interested in music since he was a kid, so it was a challenge. But I knew that also, listen, this film I made, of course, for people like us who love John Williams, who grew up with him, or idolize him. But I almost would say that I made it for people who were not born yet, people who will discover Jaws and say, who did the music to this? Oh my God, there's a documentary on a guy named John Williams, and I think that's why I feel that I had to be very rigorous with the running time and with a structure that someone who knows nothing about John is going to be hooked, And that's why I started with Jaws, because Jaws is really part of, you just have to go like, ta-da, and people, pretty much everybody knows that worldwide. And then allow myself to start going back in time to his childhood and his education and stuff. But I didn't want to start with I was born, da 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 da, But and I'm sorry, I'll let you ask the question. But I do a lot of work. I write a script, like a movie script, and we have a board with cards, and we move things around. With my editors, it's a lot of work. It's very pressured. But I have to tell you, each time I looked around the cutting room, everybody had a smile on their faces. It's not always the case, because we were doing something that I think everybody felt good about.
I'm curious about the kind of research you did. I mean, obviously you've done all these features on John's scores over the years, so it's not like you were learning about it for the first time. But did you rewatch a lot of these films, or how did you go about prepping for your interviews with him and just presenting the bits you do about each of these scores?
So what I did is not unlike what I always do, which was I asked one of my editors, David Palmer, who is a savant and knows so much about John. I said, you've got to create playlist for me, this time period, the TV stuff. And I literally listened to the music nonstop for the entire period of the film. Now, that was not a challenge, because I think I listened to something by John every day, whether it's in the car or working out, whatever. I always listen to something by him every day. But this was much more kind of introspective kind of study. And yes, I rewatched the films a lot to see, there's such a big difference between watching a film just for pleasure, entertainment, and watching a film for study. You start seeing things that you've never seen before, even if you've seen the movie many times. So this was sort of similar, except I was listening a lot more than I was watching, But the good news was I was prepping also for my new film, which is about Jaws, that I'm finishing up right now. And I was writing a book on Brian De Palma at the time. So all of that was sort of like feeding into a universe, but I literally bathed myself in that universe. And yes, I do a lot of research, but a lot of it had been done for the past 30 years, because I think I've interviewed potentially John the most than anybody else through all those different films I've worked on with Steven. And I just remembered when I started working at Amblin, I would go and hang out with Kenny Weinberg, who was John's music editor. This absolutely extraordinary man. I don't know, did you ever know Kenny?
I interviewed him on the phone, but that was it.
Oh my God, just so funny. And I would go into his office and he would tell me all those stories. And then John would come in and say, what are you guys doing? Kenny needs to get back to work, And it was amazing. So I've had the privilege of talking to those people for so long that the stories sort of came to me. But you should see my when I'm actually interviewing people, I have like a conductor, basically, sheet music, what's it called, music stand. And my questions for John are just like, it's like a map. I summarize each question, I write them all first, long form, long questions with context. And then the challenge is to reduce them to one word per question. And that becomes my map, so it's very much like a Picasso, but interesting.
I got two last questions for you. Is there a kind of deep cut John Williams movie you would recommend everybody check out that they might not have seen before or be aware that he scored? Kind of a off-road favorite of yours that more people need to know about?
Well, I would say De Palma's The Fury is a really interesting movie, because De Palma is someone who loves music. In fact, in his early career, he worked with Bernard Herrmann, who was Hitchcock's composer. And so The Fury is like kind of a bizarre sort of supernatural movie, but there is a sequence in the film during which there's pretty much no sound effects, and this character escapes and is being chased and ultimately saved, and it's completely paced to music, and that sequence alone, I think, is showing the power of editing, directing, but film scoring. That sequence is really amazing, and that's a film that is sadly dated, but that still lives pretty contemporarily through the music.
Good answer. The Fury, check it out. And then my final question is, you said very beautifully that this film in some ways is for people who aren't born yet, and it's about the essence of the story of the music of John Williams. So what is the essence? If you had to kind of articulate what the essence of this story you were trying to tell was.
Well, I'm going to quote Hitchcock. There's this great scene in Rebecca, Hitchcock's Rebecca, when she falls in love with Max in the winter, and he said, what has this moment of us together meeting has meant to you? And she said, well, I wish I could put it into a bottle, and whenever I want to, I open it and I smell it, and I can relive the moment. And I think that's what I try to do.